Should you avoid buying wines from regions that have experienced wildfires? What are the main causes of wildfires in wine country? Which two weather based factors are the strongest predictors of the severity of wildfires each season? What impact do wildfires have on the taste of your wine? And why is it difficult to predict whether smoke exposed grapes will in fact produce tainted wine? Why does smoke taint intensify as wine ages? And how can wineries mitigate the risk of producing smoke-tainted wine? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in our chat with Dr. Wes Zandberg, a professor at the University of British Columbia whose research focuses on these issues. His work is relevant not just to wildfires in Canadian wine regions, but also to those happening around the world with alarming regularity. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to Unreserved Wine Talk. By the end of today's episode, you'll also discover why the wildfires started so early in 2024, how fire actually plays an important role in the forest ecosystem, the economic impact of wildfires on the wine industry, why it's challenging to predict smoke taint through analytical tools alone, how yeast activity contributes to smoke taint in wine post-fermentation, why smoke taint shows up differently in different wines despite the same level of exposure of the grapes, the health risk associated with wine made from smoke-exposed grapes, why the perception of smoke taint becomes stronger with every sip, the similarities and differences between wildfire smoke exposure and the smoky aromas from oak barrels, the grape varieties that are most susceptible to smoke taint, how wildfires have affected BC, California, and Australia wine regions differently, and how understanding more about the terroir of terroir, could positively impact the wine industry. Okay, on with the show. Before beginning his independent research career at the University of British Columbia, Wes Zandberg earned a PhD in chemistry at Simon Fraser University. He says he loved the rainy weather so much in the Fraser Valley that he remained at SFU, completing his postdoctoral research. Wes is fascinated with glycoscience, which we'll ask him about. As far as I can understand it, the molecular analysis of sugars and carbohydrates, and he has developed both analytical tools and methods for their study. His research includes the analysis of milk and dairy products, mucus, fungi, seaweeds, placental tissues, and wine and grapes, which is what we're going to focus on. Wes spends his free time shuttling his kids between sporting events and piano practices. He occasionally makes wine, and he joins us now from his office at UBC in Kelowna. Welcome, Wes. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you, Natalie, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Great. Okay, before we dive into wine and wildfires, tell us a little bit about making wine. Was this in your home or at a winemaking facility? Just curious.
Yeah, viewers are probably going to gasp when I say this, but I started making wine in graduate school.
With air quotes for those who are listening.
Because in the Fraser Valley, actually, there's ample blackberries, and I picked those and made wine out of that. So it's debatable if anything fermented that's not grape is technically wine. However, this actually did sort of spark in me a real interest in wine chemistry because, quite obviously, a berry or a plum or an apple or whatever is not a grape. And so this becomes an instance of chemical reverse engineering. What is missing in these other things that is present in a grape, and how can I tweak the conditions to make something like a blackberry Bordeaux or something like that? So honestly, that is how I got into making wine. I didn't actually make wine from grapes until I started my smoke taint research. And then I've been making wine, of course, in the lab.
Ha, that is fascinating. Is anything unusual ever happened when you were making either the blackberry wine or the wine in your lab?
Oh, yikes. Lots of unusual things. I would say one of the most life threatening things happened to me while I was picking berries. I found that the cleanest berries and the ripest would be growing along irrigation or drainage ditches along farmers' fields, and was happily picking next to a herd of dairy cattle one day and failed to realize there was a rather irate bull in the field. I sprinted to safely, actually, and saved about 3 gallons of berries. So I think I have a record for fastest sprint through blackberry thorns carrying berries.
That's something. That's great.
So my work is on smoke taint, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But obviously, one thing we do is we make wine from smoke-exposed berries and hopefully controls. And we did that one year and then got a bunch of experts, some people that are better at tasting wines than me. And interestingly, this panel preferred the smoked wine to the non-smoked wine, which might actually say something about our skill in making wine. I'm not sure. But they could certainly tell the difference, but the preference was for the smoky one.
Wow, that is fascinating. And if you ever came up with a wine label or brand, maybe you have, but if you haven't and wanted to create one, do you have any ideas of what you'd name your wine?
Oh, yikes. I'm partial to blackberry Bordeaux. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's great. That is good. Blackberry Bordeaux with a little wildfire on the finish. Cool. All right. So before we dive into wildfires, we should note, just as way of preface, that this year, 2024, well, 2023, going into 2024 in the winter was a really dry winter and the warmest winter on record in Canada. This encouraged an early bud break on the vines in British Columbia. Then the region experienced a severe frost in January, up to minus 27 Celsius degrees, which really sadly killed the buds and 97% of the crop. While wineries are selling stock from previous vintages, this is going to have a ripple effect, not just for this year's vintage, but for several years to come, since vines don't recover from frost damage in just 1 year. So BC wineries are already behind the 8 ball before the wildfire season has started. Do you have any observations on that aspect, or shall we just move right to the wildfires?
Yeah, actually, one thing I should mention is what you say is correct about the January frost killing a lot of bud. Actually, in the 2022-23 season, we had an extremely warm fall. And then in December of that year, about less than 24 hours, the temperature changed, I don't know, almost 20 degrees. And the vines weren't ready. And so we had actually lots of vines actually killed. The whole plant was dead. Rootstocks were cracked and things like that. In this growing year, we were already planning a big replant in BC. What I should say about last year's vintage, though, so we had this really big cold snap in December of 2022. The surviving grapes in 2023 were fantastic until the smoke came. That's what we're going to talk about. But the grapes that made it were good. So people were optimistic. And then this last winter, like you mentioned, we had this January cold snap that killed a lot of bud. So yeah, the industry here, it's going to be lean. That is for sure. There are two interesting things about that. This is a little bit outside my expertise, but I am aware that there are hybrid varietals that are very, very frost hardy. And so actually there may be some wineries or vineyards that actually get reasonable crop from those. And the second thing I would point out is that there is research that I'm aware of going on in Canada on frost resistant rootstock and things like that. And I think there's some promising leads there, although this isn't my main area of work.
Sure, I understand that. And for anyone who's curious or doesn't know, hybrids are usually a cross. They're not the traditional or classic Venus vinifera grapes like your Chardonnay or Cabernet and so on. They can still make good wines, but they tend to be like Baco Noir is one, Vidal is another, Seville Blanc. Those are examples of hybrid grapes that they are, as you say, more winter resistant, winter hardy, the vine stock. Great. Okay. So apart from human error and lightning, How do a lot of these wildfires start, or is that the majority cause?
Yeah, that is, of course, the vast majority. In 2021, we had some pretty serious fires in the Kelowna region. The Kelowna is in the middle of BC's Okanagan Valley. And so the entire Okanagan, particularly the south, is where the majority of BC's grapes are. So that 2021 fire really affected the Okanagan Valley because it was local. That was arson. So I wouldn't call arson human error because like it's human malevolence or I don't know. Yeah, those are the main ones. There has been some suspicion that some BC fires were sparked by trains, so that the wheel sparks, and of course logging operations can spark. But because of those concerns, of course, many logging outfits close down in the summer, especially when it's very, very dry. They just won't work. But yeah, vast majority is lightning and human caused.
Wow. Wow. Oh my gosh. I can't imagine why someone would want to do arson. That's beyond the pale. My God, so much destruction. Oof. Okay. So let's set the stage. What happened with wildfires last year? Like, kind of give us a high level scope of how much burnt and how that related to wine country in terms of the damage.
Oh, wildfires just was horrid across Canada. I think the numbers were like 16 million hectares or something like that. I don't know how many acres that is. It's just enormous. I mean, we obliterated the 1989 record, which was the last record. And I think it was just a dry early spring across the country. We had fires out east in Quebec, Ontario. And your viewers may remember that smoke drifted all the way down to New York City and other US states, even Pennsylvania. And that was very early. And Alberta and BC got involved with some massive fires. The numbers in BC were in the millions of hectares burned, again, due to, in part, hot, dry conditions. I should say it's obvious that the hotter and the drier the forest is, the more combustible the fuel is, and the faster the fire takes off. But also, as forest industry has developed in BC and also the United States, and also as areas have become more populated, it's been, of course, imperative for industrial and safety reasons, especially for the past 120 years or so, to really rapidly put out forest fires. And before that, what happened is forest fires would frequently just blow through our old growth forest. They'd clean the underbrush and the fuel, but they would never get into the crowns of the trees. And this was really good because it kept the density of the forests from getting too thick. In fact, many species of trees we have in BC, at least, don't even release their seeds unless a fire goes through. They need that heat. And that's just part of how they reproduce. And so that was sort of the normal state of things. But as we suppress fires, the fuel burden increases. And in BC, starting, I think, in the early 90s, I think maybe even earlier than that, but we had several insect infestations. The worst was the mountain pine beetle, and it destroyed millions of hectares of trees. So now the trees are dead and the young trees are growing up. So what all this means is, yes, last year was early heat and dry, but the fuel load is enormous. And so when you combine those things, it's a recipe for a perfect storm.
Absolutely. And I love the terms fuel load, like all the dry brush, the dead trees. I mean, that just builds up. And as you say, usually Mother Nature would take care of this naturally in the past, but humans have intervened, and fire suppression is not letting these fires burn where perhaps they should. And so it's like a pent up demand. So when something goes, there's so much dry shrubbery, so many dead trees, like it's like an explosion.
Yeah, precisely. And I would say, having fire naturally go through and thin a forest was the norm. I think now the fire load just makes that untenable.
You can't even try to do it that way anymore. Okay. Wow.
Now, what is required, and this would be something a forester would be more able to talk to, but I think we have to go into some of these areas where there's just a lot of dead trees and use machines to get them out of there. Because the issue is, and this is what happened across Canada and also in the Okanagan near Kelowna where I am, is when you got that much fuel on the ground, that fire gets so hot, then it leaps up into the crowns.
Ah, the tops of the trees. Yeah.
And in BC, very similar to California, in the conifer forests, you have all these conifer trees, and the crowns have got all these needles with all these oils. It's like gasoline. And the trees literally explode, and you get these massive fires that leap from crown to crown. And they're intense enough that these fires even create their own weather events. But that happens when the fire gets up in the crown instead of just stays on the ground and burns through.
They create their own weather events. They change the weather, like they create smog and so on?
Well, that too, but I mean, I think suck the oxygen into the fire at such a rate that it creates things like tornadoes and things like that. So we have in BC, I know that we have instances where crown fires are so vicious that entire burning trees are yanked out of the ground, roots and all, and they're flung across an entire valley.
Oh my gosh, by nature, just by force of the.
It's just like the tornado, the whirlwind just pulls them out. We didn't have something quite so serious here last year, but this is the real risk, right? Because when a fire gets that high in the trees, then you get embers and things that are launched miles. And that's exactly what happened last year in August. Like I mentioned, we had a 2022 vine kill from frost. The surviving grapes were fantastic from all that I've heard. And then in August 15, I think, on the west side of Okanagan Lake, so it's about 140-kilometer long lake that just runs right up the valley. And Kelowna is kind of straddled on both sides of that lake, right in the middle of wine region. We had a fire start on the west side. It just raced down the hill, burned a whole resort, about 75 structures or something like that. Just raced down. And on the east side of the lake, I mean, that's a 3-kilometer, maybe a little bit more jump. Everybody was watching there and they were like, yikes, that looks bad. And then suddenly sparks just fly kilometers across the lake. And it starts again on the Kelowna side. And so at the peak of that fire, I think we had 35,000 people evacuated, over 100 structures burned. And it was right next to some reasonably large vineyards. Of course, there was some vine damage. Not a lot, but some. But the big risk, of course, is we just had weeks and weeks. The surviving grapes sucked in fresh local smoke. And that's the big risk.
Yeah. And that's where we're heading to our discussion. Oh, that's incredible. Wow. It's so visual. It's like the special effects you would expect in a movie, except this is real life. Fire, tornadoes, and trees ripped out of their roots by oxygen getting sucked in. Oh, my goodness. Okay. So, although there were several small wildfires in April of this year near Oliver, which is also the Okanagan Valley, they have since been contained. The current wildfires near Fort Nelson are about 1,400 kilometers away, and this is as of June 5th, 2024. However, those in wine country are bracing for wildfires that could be worse than last year. Why did the wildfires start so early this year, Wes?
Well, the ones up north, mainly because we had an unusually mild and dry winter. And this was predicted. We knew heading into this winter that it was an El Nino year.
And El Nino is what? It's the warm ocean currents that come up from South America?
I believe so. That the technical definition we would have to look up, but I believe if the ocean surface temperature stays above average for a certain length of time, it's considered an El Nino, and that predictably affects the climate, especially on the West Coast. And it means it's going to be milder. It actually, in some parts of the West Coast, in particular California and southern BC, it means we're wetter. And the normally dry parts got drier. And that was particularly pronounced up north where we had these early fires. And on top of that, the two big ones that I'm aware of, there was one in Fort Nelson and one in Fort McMurray, which is in Alberta. And the Fort Nelson one was sparked by power poles going down and sparking a fire. So we had sort of a dry condition and then a human-caused fire, I guess you could say. The Fort McMurray one, interestingly, was a forest fire that had been burning all winter.
Is that what they call a zombie fire or a holdover fire?
Yeah, I actually haven't heard the term before, but yes, that makes sense.
Zombie? The Walking Dead, they come alive again and as soon as the season returns.
So what happens is these fires are so hot that they can kind of follow stumps and roots under the ground, or they could get into peat, and then it just sort of smolders under a blanket of snow. So it just...
Even without a lot of oxygen, they can stay alive. Wow, sort of.
There's so little oxygen that it doesn't flame, but it stays hot enough.
Okay. But it stays
that
hot.
When the snow disappears, you get a fire pop up. And so, yes, this is frequent, I think. And that was what happened in the Fort McMurray fire.
Wow. Okay. And as well, like we're saying, drier winter. I've seen sort of more technical terms, like there was significantly less snowpack. So there was a lot of snow had built up over the winter, and that can help mitigate some conditions, especially that dry ground fuel, but that didn't even help.
Yeah, so A wetter winter would be helpful. Drier winter increases the risk. What's really, really quite important, though, is independent of whether it's a wet or a dry winter. What's quite critical for this part of Canada in particular is how late spring is. So, how quickly does the snow we have, whether it's normal or not, evaporate or run off? And the second thing is do we actually get adequate seasonal rains? So, actually, in this part of the world, it is naturally dry, but we actually have a bit of a rainy period in June trailing into July.
Right. And that's peak fire season too, isn't it?
Well, that's just before it, but
Oh, just before it. Okay.
I think so, yeah. But that's really critical because, you could have a dry winter and then have adequate rains. So this is sort of the situation we've had in the Okanagan, at least this year. We did have a dry winter, but we had a really, really cool, wet spring. So that's good. Now we could flip that and go into really hot, dry summer, but we've got some moisture in the ground now. That is not the case up north, and that is, I believe, the influence of El Nino. So we have to keep two things in mind: is the winter wet and is there moisture in the ground there? But also, do we just get the normal amount of seasonal rains, which does, well, basically it doesn't stop fire risk, but it kind of creates a more normal fire season.
Sure. Now, again, I know you've already mentioned forestry isn't your expertise, but still, it's really helpful to, really put this in a good framework. One of the things, if I understand correctly, is that the Forestry Service has satellites and drones that monitor these hotspots or zombie fires or holdover fires or whatever. And you can put them out. The best time of the year is January when it's cold and damp, I guess. But is that part of the ongoing kind of monitoring? And has that been effective? Or, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I mean, we do have technology, some of it's satellite based, where we can get a pretty good infrared picture of things. I don't know if it's just not possible to dig those fires out in the winter. It may not be, but I doubt that. I do also think that a lot of the fire service is disbanded in the winter because there's less risk. So I think maybe because they're not a 12-month year round organization, they just don't have the resources. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, cool. So, one of the strongest predictors of how intense the wildfire season will be is the late spring, early summer rainfall season, which you've mentioned. This sets the stage for the critical peak wildfire season. Again, it's okay if it's outside your area of expertise, but do you have an idea of how much precipitation has to fall or to make a sizable, literally a dampering effect on wildfire season?
It depends if you're in the valleys. I think in this part of the southern interior of BC, I can't comment too much else, but I think about 30 millimeters would be reasonable in the valleys, and then a bit higher up, but like the high elevation plateaus, maybe 50 millimeters would be a normal season, and that would be mostly precipitation coming in June-ish, July. That would just create a normal risk, like a more usual, yeah.
Right. According to one forester that I did communicate with him, thanks to you, he was saying that rainfall is harder to predict than other weather conditions. So that makes predicting wildfire season so difficult. It's just harder for them to predict average rainfall, which can change. All right. So, what do people misunderstand about the controlled burning of old forests? So, we touched on it a little bit that it actually has to happen. But why do people resist that? Some people, not everybody.
I don't know, but yeah, I mean, it did naturally happen. And like I mentioned, this is really quite amazing to me. Some trees just simply won't release their seeds unless they have the heat from the fire. Interestingly, burning plants create classes of compounds, they're called carotenoids, that are also like plant hormones that trigger plant growth. So, fire is actually naturally sort of built into the ecosystem here. So I don't think people would resist that, except now that is no longer tenable given just the density of fuel and the proximity of urban centers and things like that. So what I think might be a little bit more controversial, though, is okay, well, we can't maybe have frequent fires as part of the landscape management but we can carefully log it, or we can sometimes get machines in there and then thin things out and things like that. And I think there you'll find more resistance. I do think that actually careful, well-managed logging industry mimics many of the beneficial impacts of fire. So yes, you're cutting down trees, but you're thinning the forest out. The remaining trees get more of the water, and there's less shade, less fuel, and things like that for young seedlings, and the fire risk is lower.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, I think this is just things that I've been reading in the news, but I do think that some people misunderstand just how much fire is integral to the circle of life in nature, and that some advocate just we have to save all trees, including especially old trees. But sometimes that's not the case. It actually will sacrifice more of the forest if you don't either let Mother Nature do what it's supposed to do or control it in some way with strategic logging or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, this is a little off topic, but why not? I mean, if you think about it from a carbon perspective too, right? Old trees get sick. They're no longer sequestering carbon from carbon dioxide. Young trees that are growing rapidly, they're taking a lot of CO2 out of the air, actually. So we like the idea, the mystique of old growth forest. But really, if you think of what we call old growth forest now is old growth because we didn't have those frequent fires coming through and cleaning things up. You didn't necessarily have such dense old growth forests 100, 200 years ago because fire comes through and cleans it up all the time. So there's a lot of different facets to these questions of management and fire risk, that's for sure.
Absolutely. All right. So I'll finally get to your area of expertise. You've been a very good sport about this whole, because I wanted to have the larger picture first. So beyond the actual fires themselves, either destroying vines or wineries or the infrastructure like vine posts and so on, how do wildfires affect wine itself?
Yes. So it's the smoke from the wildfire that's a big risk. And this is one that's really kind of thorny and hard pinned down because smoke exposure does not necessarily lead to a tainted wine. In fact, finding molecules responsible for smoky aromas in your wine or grapes does not necessarily mean that the wine is not a good wine. So there's a lot of murkiness about this and perhaps misunderstanding. But yes, definitely it is very possible that smoke from wildfires, in some instances distant wildfires, can drift into a vineyard. And we've had it here where that smoke just settles in for 2-3 weeks at a row. And if that happens when the wine grapes are, usually they have to be post veraison a few weeks.
So where they turn from that green to red or whatever color they're going to be when they mature.
Yeah, this is research that's been done out of the Australian Wine Research Institute. They're pioneers in this, not me, I have to confess. But they've shown that post-veraison period, grapes are most susceptible to leading to tainted wine. So I would say the biggest risk, and it's also the hardest one to calculate, right? Because, I can do some digging in the numbers. I do this if I'm applying for funding, right? Everybody wants to see the bad news, and then I give them the solution. So I can tell you that mega fire event in California in 2020, I believe, costed the industry about $600 million. Now, that includes in California, of course, obvious loss of grapes and like the vines burned. It also factors in loss of tourist revenue, and somehow, somewhere in there, people try to put in smoke taint or smoked impact. But how do you calculate that, right? Like any decent winery in the States or Canada, if they find that they got smoky wine sit in the winery, they're not going to put it on the shelf. They're not going to say, oh, well, maybe my consumers aren't going to notice. They're not going to risk it. They're just going to dump the wine. And then there's no insurance available, and so they don't report it. And so how you put a number value on that, that's quite difficult. But I would say, hundreds of millions probably is lost due to wine that's just simply not sellable because it doesn't taste good.
My goodness. So what happens when smoke taint does affect the wine, permeating the grape skin? It's going in after veraison, after it's turned veraison, after it's turned color. What is it actually doing? What happens? And when does it express itself? And what sort of, you said it wasn't detectable at first, but what's happening?
Okay, so there's a few things here. You may have to ask your question again if I don't get to it. We talk about smoke taint, but I would like to propose a different word just to clarify things a little bit, and that it would be smoke impact. So smoke is produced when biomass, wood, plants, other things burns. And plants the major structural material in plant. Biochemist would call lignocellulose, right? So it's basically lignin. That's like the stuff that makes plants waterproof, and the cellulose and other things is what makes it rigid. It's kind of like the rebar of a plant, it makes it strong. And when those materials burn, particularly the stuff called lignin, it creates a whole bunch of different molecules, and these are called phenols. The simplest phenol is just phenol, and this is the antiseptic used in some hospitals. So that's sort of sick, sweet smell you smell in a hospital sometime. That's the simplest phenol.
It's a molecule, is it?
Yeah, it's a molecule. Yeah. And then we have different chemical variations of a phenol, so different tweaks to the molecule a little bit. And they all smell a little bit different, but they're all incredibly pungent. And so we have things like guaiacol. This is a very famous one. It smells smoky. And then we have cresols, they smell ashy, and things like syringol, that's medicinal, and 4-ethylphenol. This is an interesting one. It's produced by burning fuel. It's also produced by spoilage yeasts like Brettanomyces, and it's responsible for Brett taint, which is like the barnyard smell you get in some wines. So all of these are related molecules, and they can be produced when wood or plants and things like that burn. They can also be produced from oak barrels, which is maybe something we can discuss a little bit later. But these compounds, we'll just call them volatile phenols. Because they're volatile, they boil at low temperatures, and because it can exist as gases at low temperatures, we can perceive them by our sense of smell very easily. They're completely different than the other phenolics like tannins and the pigments that we have in wine. Those aren't volatile at all.
Okay. They're not airborne, or they don't boil at low temperatures, as you say. Yeah.
No. So they're somewhat related chemically because they share obviously the same kind of chemical groups, but there are differences that make one class volatile and therefore perceptible by smell, and another class is just not. So it influences the color and the astringency of the wine, but not really your perception by smell. So these phenols, interestingly, some of them are naturally produced by plants, including grapes. So some grapes naturally have reasonable levels of these volatile phenols that are also found in smoke.
What would be an example of that? Which grapes naturally have a smoky kind of character?
Well, a very, very famous example would be Shiraz, or Syrah, has extremely high levels of a volatile phenol called syringol, or some people say syringol. But syringol is very, very high levels in Shiraz. They also have some guaiacol, and if you go to your wine textbook and look it up, if it's an old enough book, they'll say, well, that's responsible for the spicy or the peppery smell of those wines. So it's not necessarily unattractive. So these compounds can be naturally produced, some of them anyways, at some levels in grapes. They also originate in wine from contact with oak, which is something we can talk about more in a little bit. But my point is that they exist in high concentrations in smoke, particularly fresh smoke, which then gets transported to a vineyard, and then those phenols responsible for the aroma of smoke are absorbed into the grape tissue, and we can sometimes detect them, which means the smoke impacted the grape. But its simple presence does not necessarily mean that that grape or that wine will be tainted, because like I've already mentioned, these can enter wines through oak, and they can exist naturally at very high levels in some varieties like Shiraz, for example. So smoke taint, I would say we should be careful to use smoke taint for actually a glass of wine that you drank that is not good.
Smells and tastes like an ashtray, maybe.
Yeah. But you can't just do a chemical test and say, well, that's smoke tainted. Smoke taint I would keep for a subjective, personal sensory assessment of the wine, because we can always show. We have very good analytical instruments. That's my job. So I can almost always detect things. But that doesn't mean it's going to influence negatively how you perceive your glass of wine. But this then gets to the really, really tricky bit about prediction. So I mentioned these phenols. There's about 10 to 12 common ones that we look for with our analytical tests. And we know they're in smoke, and we know that these things are responsible for the aroma of smoky whiskeys, like a peaty whiskey, or smoked meat, or even they naturally occur in plants like tomato and basil, right? One of the main things that gives basil its taste are volatile phenols that are also found in smoke. So they're naturally there. one of the tricky things is when we have these exogenous phenols come to a grape, they're absorbed. How they're absorbed into the grape tissue is still under debate. But we know that they get in. They get into the grape. So you could say, well, this is very easy. I mean, I just test the grape, and if that volatile phenol concentration is high enough, then it's tainted. But the grape just won't leave those phenols alone. What the grape will do is a grape, especially if it's ripening, it's full of sugar, right? And it's full of enzymes. And grapes will take the enzymes in the grape and the sugar in the grape, and they'll basically put a sugar onto the volatile phenol. They will make a new molecule. They will take a sugar and combine it with the phenol to make a new thing that has sugar chemically linked to it. That's not going to break down at all. And this is very, very similar actually to how our bodies, an animal for that matter, would detoxify drugs. Right? If you take an aspirin or whatever you take and you eat that, and your body will metabolize that by linking it to sugars, and then it's usually excreted from the body, usually in your urine or something like that. And plants do the same thing to make things less toxic. This is a plant's way of taking things that are somewhat dangerous to the plant and making them not really offensive. It's very, very common biochemically, even like I said, in people. But what happens then is two things. One is you can take a single volatile phenol, just take guaiacol. That's one of the most pungent, okay? And just so you take guaiacol, but you can put many different combinations of sugar on there. Not just one product is formed. So it's really difficult to know what you're looking for, first of all. And second of all, if you take a phenol and put a sugar on it, the whole new thing that the plant produced is basically sugar-like. In other words, you can't smell it. It's not volatile. It's just hanging out in the grape, well-behaved. You can eat that grape and it tastes perfectly fine. Right? So you don't actually normally have exceedingly high concentrations of these volatile phenols in smoke-exposed grapes. It's a really, really difficult analytical chemistry question. What happens then is you have grapes that taste fine, they smell fine, you don't really have high levels detectable by the testing labs. So the winery goes to harvest those grapes, and then they macerate and squash, and they do all kinds of fun things in the winery, and then they add the yeast. And the yeast has enzymes that are dedicated to breaking sugars off of things. That is kind of a requirement, for fermentation, breakdown of sugars and things like that. And so yeast take these phenols that you can't smell because they're behaving more like the sugars to which they are attached, and the yeast breaks that sugar off. And now the phenol is free again. And so what the big risk is grapes that smell fine, that then 5 months later, we've got 20,000 liters of tainted wine.
Right, because the yeast has resurrected those smoke taint molecules, and now it's expressing itself, but only post-fermentation. And as you say, they've already spent the money on harvesting the grapes, making it, and then they're left with all this unsellable wine. Holy, wow.
Yeah. And also, of course, wine is no longer a crop. So if you've picked it and fermented
Why
it.
is that? It's not a crop?
Well, no, grape is a crop. So if it's on the vine in the vineyard, it's considered a crop. So crop insurance applies. Once you've picked it, I can't technically call it a crop anymore because you did something to it. So then you're not eligible for crop insurance. Maybe there's some other insurance, but right. So insurers, if you suspect your grape is tainted, but again, you might not because it tastes fine and it smells fine, and the testing lab comes back and says your numbers look good. And a vineyard in my part of Canada, we're not as hot consistently as California. We can't produce the yields that the southern vineyards can. So vineyards here, wineries, they need every grape they can get. They might just harvest at risk anyways. But the point is that once you've picked it, there's no real possibility of crop insurance anymore.
Wow. Okay. My goodness, that's really painting them into a box. And so sometimes then, do I understand correctly? Sometimes these bad smoke molecules can get into the grape and then it goes through fermentation and still doesn't express itself? Like it could be okay as well?
Yes. So this is really quite fascinating to me. I just actually simply don't have the student power to do this work. If you look up some numbers, concentration of these, we'll call them volatile phenols, this whole class of smoky aroma molecules, if you look at the concentrations that are found in some oaked wines, they can exceed that which is found in a tainted wine. We did this. So In 2019, we got about 10 wines from the Okanagan region that were all tainted. That was a Washington state fire that blew up and tainted a bunch of Southern vineyards. And I don't believe any of those wines were ever marketed except two, and they were marketed as tainted wines. So one was called Fumé Franc, and the other was Smoke Show or something. And actually, they sold pretty well, but they were deliberately labeled smoke tainted. But we got these wines that were varying degrees smoke tainted. We had a bunch of different labs test the concentration of these aroma molecules. And we did sensory analysis. That was done with my very kind collaborators in Australia. So they did the sensory on that. So we compare the chemical data with the sensory data. What I can tell you is that the numbers that our labs were getting for the volatile phenols were below what you would find in a heavily oaked wine. So that tells you there's something else going on with the story. And so just to add to that, in I can't remember the year. One year we had fires, 21, I think. There were two side-by-side vineyards that I'm aware of, just an hour south of where I am in Kelowna. And both of them on the same side of the road were socked in smoke for about 2 weeks. One of them, I know very well, produced a horrid product. It was a rosé. We can talk about why they chose to produce a rosé a little while, but it was not good. And the other one, I talked to the winemaker, and he's a consultant as well, and he knew that there was going to be a problem. And so he said, well, you know what? We're going to try fancy yeast. He said, fancy yeast. And that wine hit the shelves. I bought a bottle. It was good. And it was a white, but it wasn't tainted. And so if we put these two things together, right? If we know a heavily oaked wine in some, not all, but in some instances, high levels of volatile phenols. And we also know that sometimes a winemaker can use fancy yeast and he can hide the taint. And that's the point. It's not so simple as saying, well, the concentration exceeds this limit, therefore the wine is tainted. Because wines have other aroma molecules that can either positively or negatively influence the perception of the taint. And I think that there's an important story here. What happens when wine grapes are exposed to smoke is the plants not only take the volatile phenols in, but they also get stressed out. And they're not producing the same amount of volatiles and other things that they normally would. And so what you get is a combination between, yes, the phenol is in there, but also you have a grape of less fruity character, and there's less things that are just simply going to mask the taint. And so I think we need to add that into the equation. And that's not an easy thing to do, but I think that will allow for better risk prediction.
That's a complicated but fascinating number of factors that are interacting here. So could it be in the future that if you use a fancy yeast and maybe plant more Syrah, which tends to be smokier in nature anyway, and do a full-bodied with oak aging, you could help mitigate even when there are wildfires?
Yes.
Like make it sellable at least. I don't know.
Yeah, so Syrah I wouldn't recommend here. It's the least frost tolerant, or Shiraz. Yeah, so unfortunately all our Shiraz is dead now because it can't handle the frost. But I mean, now if we're getting to mitigating, I mean, there's some obvious things that wineries can do. And Australia has really kind of pioneered lists of tricks and things like that. But some are quite obvious. So for instance, we know that the majority of these phenols, however they're trapped in grapes, right? If they're combined with other sugars or whatever, we know that the majority of them, over 50%, are stuck on the skins. All right. So first of all, if you can make a rosé, right, don't ferment on skins. And that means also smoke taint is less problematic for white. It's not absent, but it's less problematic for white wine, which isn't fermented on skins. You can also simply just take it easy on the macerating enzymes. Just minimize what you're doing to the skin. And if you can, don't machine harvest, pick by hand, and try not to bust things up too much, right?
Right, because that'd be releasing them into the flesh of the grape if you're heavy handling.
Yeah, so there are some things that can be done. Fancy yeast, I think it's a great idea, but it's risky, right? It's not quite clear why that worked. In this instance, it did, but it's not something that you can easily extrapolate. And the wineries in the Okanagan here just talk occasionally to some people. They're very, very inventive and have come up with, in some cases, some good solutions. How applicable they are to other settings yet, I don't know. But some people tried different fining agents or additives that hopefully absorb the aromas. People in both sides of the border have tried reverse osmosis or tangential filtrations or other attempts to mitigate, and to varying degrees of success. So it would be quite interesting, I think, to get these people together and start to organize a little bit, because a lot of this stuff isn't shared that widely.
Right. Get more methodical about it. Can you actually wash the grapes, or would that be just too manhandling it, or I don't know?
Oh, have you been reading my grant proposals or?
Yes, secretly. I do a lot of preparation for these interviews, Wes.
So this is really interesting. So I have done some work on this, and so has Australia, where we deliberately smoke grapes in the field. We have some very kind, very generous vineyards that are willing to let irresponsible academics burn stuff on their vineyards in the middle of bad forest fire season. And so we deliberately bag some grapes, we smoke them, we have control and things like that. And so we've done experiments where we smoke grapes and then cut them off the vine immediately and wash them, and you can't wash the phenols off. Australia has done similar things. They've even tried combinations of like water and alcohol to see if that works. And the best that I can see combing through Australian literature is you can't wash it off. But that would be an obvious solution. I do believe you can. My students are working on this right now. So come back in a year or so and maybe we'll have some answers. We're working on this. I do believe you can. But the one thing is, ideally, where you would want to wash it off is in the vineyard before you actually pick it. So that's the trick. Because if you're a really, really big vineyard, right, you've got grapes coming in on like 18-wheel semi-trucks. They're getting squashed on the truck. There's no washing that. It's just going straight into the crusher or the stemmer, right? So things are a little smaller and more polite in Canada, and maybe you could wash things as things are coming off the field. But a big solution would be, can we wash it right there in the vineyard? Can we wash it off?
Right. Just before I keep going here, I'm wondering though, like, okay, let's say we get a wine that is technically tainted with smoke, but we like the taste of it. Is there any health impact to drinking something like that? Or it's okay, it's still in that family of volatile phenols, like as if the wine had been oak aged. It's all the same. Don't worry about smoke taint health wise.
No, I don't think. I mean, these things, like, yes, we can perceive them, yes, but that's just because we have an ability to perceive by smell something at such an incredibly low concentration. I don't believe there's a health risk there. We have also done some fermentation studies. So you could say, well, if these things are toxic, do they affect the yeast, right? Then you would expect to have the fermentation rate changed and things like that. That's something we've never noticed. So it doesn't look like it's toxic to yeast, and I don't believe it's toxic to us either. And besides, we get it from oak and tomatoes and ketchup and other things. So
Really interesting. And you said fancy yeast. So the other question, of course, would be if that winemaker's vineyard had not been exposed to wildfire and he used the fancy yeast, you wouldn't know, would it turn the wine really weird? The reverse, if it wasn't being affected by wildfire smoke.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, I don't know. Have to do controlled experiments.
Yeah, and also, I mean, actually, you have to do a lot of experiments because obviously these fancy yeasts are creating potentially masking aromas. This, by the way, is, I believe, a potential reason why smoke taint intensifies with wine aging. So it used to be thought, well, okay, so you have a pool of these volatile phenols in a grape. Some of them are free. They're just hanging out, just like they arrived from smoke. But this is a minority. The bulk of the iceberg, you have a phenol that's chemically linked to one or more sugars of various combinations, right? And so not all of that gets broken down by the yeast during fermentation. So even in the wine, you have some free phenol, probably more than you had in the grape, and that's what you perceive. But you have still a large pool of stuff that's tied up with sugars. And so the thinking was, well, these can just slowly break down with aging, and then the taint gets worse and worse and worse in the cellar. The taint does get worse and worse in the cellar. But Australian research has shown quite clearly, I think, that the actual concentration of the phenol in the wine isn't changing. So that's what Australia showed. We actually deliberately put these sugar-linked forms in wine, corked it, and then stored it for a while. And then I measured it again. And I can tell you they're rock solid. They're really stable. So we get a gradual intensification with aging. What I think is happening is as you develop new tertiary aroma compounds and some secondary aroma compounds change and so forth, again, you remove masking aromas. So concentration of everything else is changing to reveal what was already there. Just like fancy yeast could produce maybe some esters or something we don't know at this point, maybe 2-phenylethanol or something like that. And then you just got enough that masks it or something, right? So I think the same phenomena happens during aging. And so, again, this is kind of a tricky question on the mitigation side. Is yeast always going to be the solution? I doubt it.
Different factors at different points of the wine's life. It's just, wow. And I think you mentioned previously that also once the wine is in our mouths, the perception of smoke taint can become stronger with every sip. What's happening there?
That is correct. And this is really why one of the obnoxious things about smoke taint, like sometimes we like smoky aromas and it just smoky and it just sort of hangs out. But smoke taint gets worse and worse and worse and it dries out the back of your mouth. And I think it's called a retronasal perception. You kind of smell it up the back of the nose there. And what has been shown, I think reasonably well, is that the bacteria in our mouth have enzymes that are like the yeast enzymes that can chop the sugar off these phenols. And so we have our first sip and nothing much happens, but some of the bacteria go to work on the residual sugar bound forms. And then you have your second sip and then they produce more. And by the third sip, now you're getting this big production of free phenol from stuff that was initially not really perceptible. And it just slowly leads to an intensifying perception of the smokiness in the wine.
Wow. Okay. And so then just to come back to the oak barrels in which wine is aged, they're toasted in that, they're open at both ends. And then they're sort of sat over a sort of campfire, small little fire, so that they get toasted or charred on the inside to the degree that the winemaker wants them charred. Are these the same family of phenols as this wildfire smoke?
Yes, they are. And in some instances, the concentrations released from the oak into the wine may exceed that which is found in tainted wine. But there are also some differences. So, okay, again, one difference that I already mentioned was I think smoke exposure just generally reduces the fruity character of a grape and means that the grape can mask it less. Whereas if you have a really nice wine and it goes into oak, it's even nicer. The other thing is, I should mention that different kind of plant produce different relative concentrations of these phenols. So hardwoods don't produce the same kind of phenols as softwoods, which don't produce the same kind as grasses and other shrubs that would burn. And this, of course, people who like smoked meat or they like the old-fashioned barbecues, right? So you would use mesquite or hickory or cherry.
Right, and they give different smoky tastes. Yeah. The source fuel, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, because they have different combinations of phenols being produced. So hardwood is very different than softwood. You wouldn't ever use pine, the softwood, to make a barrel, right?
Is it because of the resin?
Yeah, first of all, it's resiny, it's softer, it's not as waterproof. But even if you could find a really, really hard, waterproof, dense softwood, it would not produce the same suite of volatile phenols oak would. It's unlikely that it would be the same desirable combination. And so if I look through the literature on what phenols are produced from oak and what phenols are produced from smoke-tainted grapes, particularly from British Columbia, where I am, there is some overlap, like maybe 40% of the phenols are the same, but there's some really outstanding, unique things. And those are a group of volatile phenols, which contains a lot of cresols in them, that's responsible.
They coat the wood timber and you get that sort of acrid tarry smell when you go past like a construction site.
Yeah, exactly. So when I look at my tainted wines, I have extremely small concentrations of cresols, about 3 different ones. Really, really, really low concentrations. These are not found in oak. I cannot see them in the literature. And what we did, the few sort of correlative studies between sensory and chemical analysis, show very, very clearly that those cresols, which are really hard to nail down because they're so low concentration, but those accurately are predicting the perception of taintedness, I should say. So to sum up the whole idea about oak, yes, there's some overlap. And so we know the story is not simply about absolute concentration, because otherwise oak barrel would taste like smoke, and it doesn't. So there's some mitigation due to the synergy with other desirable compounds. But at the same time, there are some very subtle differences right on the bottom end of the concentration range that I think might be responsible for the taint.
Right. And another mind blowing comparison, or I don't know, not a statistic, something you used before is that you keep saying low concentrations, but it's the equivalent of 1 teaspoon of this smoke taint molecule in an Olympic sized swimming pool and you'd pick it up. Like, that's incredible. Wow. Are there certain grapes that are more susceptible to smoke taint than others?
Again, you may have been reading my grant proposals.
You did leave your door locked last night.
This is a really good question. As far as I know, there's really one paper that sort of looked into it in Australia, but they kind of smoked everything at the same time and then looked at the taint by some sensory studies and chemical. But I mean, an obvious answer is white grapes are sensitive simply because we don't ferment them on skins, full stop. You would think that potentially thinner skinned grapes would be more sensitive. That is a reason why most of my work to date's been on Pinot Noir. The other reason being that it's a more cold tolerant red variety, so it's closer to where I am. I don't have to travel 3 hours to do field work. But really, if we go back to the observation that there are differences in risk depending on what stage in the ripening process you are. And so to really answer that question, we have to take different varietals of grapes and expose them to the same smoke at the same time in the ripening period, which is really, really hard to do experimentally, right? Like if you're going to do this, you either have to wait for a fire to happen and then just sort of chase the different varieties without adequate controls, or you'd have to tent off some grapes and smoke them. If you do everything all at the same time, you might be able to keep the smoke the same, but now you have differences in the grape. And if you want to get the grapes at the same time in the ripening cycle, then the smoke is going to be different. So this is a really, really tricky question to pin down, but I would love to give you an answer. We are hoping to do a little bit of this work. We think we can do it experimentally more simply, I guess we could say. That might let us keep the smoke more constant and then still address that question.
Sure. Well, all of these answers would go a long way toward mitigation if you can isolate these different variables. Let's see. Was there a big difference or not really between the wildfires in BC wine country versus California wine country versus Australia wine country? Maybe source fuel, I guess, but anything else?
Absolutely, between BC and Australia, and both the fuels. So in Australia, you have these big eucalyptus forests and a lot of brush. And so the predominant fuel source is hardwood, which produces, we've done this, we know very well, it produces a drastically different suite of volatile phenols than the conifers, like the pine and stuff that we have in BC and California. On top of that, a major issue in Australia is actually prescribed burns, where farmers that grow flax or barley and things like that, these agriculture residuals, they don't compost very well at all. And so the farmers can't just plow them back under the field. So like the leftover flax stalks and barley, it's just burned up. It's put into windrows and they burn it. And if that smoke then blows into a nearby vineyard, then you get smoke taint. So obviously a solution there is to carefully coordinate when you do these prescribed burns. But my point is that the fuel source is different, and therefore chemically what we see in the grape is quite different. We know this. And also we know that if you talk to Australian experts, they will say the Australian taint presents itself differently than the kind of taints we see in North America. If you compare California to BC, again, I am aware of some chemical differences. For instance, we never really see very high concentrations of these sugar-bound forms. The literature is almost unanimously in agreement that this is how they're trapped. We never see really high concentrations of those. California usually does. In BC, we have high concentrations of something that's not free, but it looks like these compounds might be tangled up with other things that aren't simply sugars. That's not, from what I can see, the case in California, although the fuel sources, I think, are somewhat similar.
Right. And in California, would they be more apt to be bound to sugar molecules because, on average, California is warmer, therefore the grapes are riper and have more sugars naturally?
Sure.
Could be. Just hypothesizing.
Yeah, no, it could be. Yeah, I mean, I can think of that's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. You're right. Yeah, it could be.
Cool. Okay. I want to join your lab. So you've mentioned some costs here. I was reading somewhere the cost to the Australian wine industry. I don't know if this has been total aggregate over the years, has been 300 million due to bushfires, or if that's 1 year. And then I think I've read or you mentioned the cost to the California industry, not just from 1 year, but over the years, could be in the billions, which is just devastating. And I mean, Canada must be in between there somewhere, but it really warrants a lot more research and a lot more. You should be getting your funding for all of this, I think.
I have some, so I'm accelerating now. I've hired several excellent students, and so we're tackling some of these things now. And mitigation, I think, is critical. And then second is prevention.
Right. Yeah. So mitigation, you've mentioned a number of things, but go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, some things I can't talk about right now because the work's ongoing and it's competitive. I'm sure.
Absolutely. I'll sneak into your office tomorrow night. No, I'm kidding.
I mean, I'm not the only one in the world working on this, and
Sure.
but we have some ideas on mitigation that we're really excited about.
Like the targeted removal of volatile phenols and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So far, people are kind of hoping for the best, right? We try reverse osmosis, we try tangential filtration. Some people have tried ozone. That just destroys everything. That's not going to work.
What is that? Ozone. What are you doing in that case? Or what are they doing?
I suspect they exposed the grapes to ozone before fermentation, but I can't remember exactly. But I mean, it destroyed the actual smoky aromas, but it destroyed everything else in the process. And that's kind of the problem with a lot of these things is you remove too much. And so
the remedy is worse than the disease or whatever that saying is.
Yeah, there has been some stuff published that uses something called molecularly imprinted polymers. That's the technical term. Just think about this like a filter. The pores in the filter are exactly the shape of the molecule that you're interested in removing. Then you can force it through. The issue is these are tremendously expensive and not reusable. But I like the idea. I mean, I think this is the way we need to go. And so we've got a few things on the go there. As far as prevention goes, obviously washing might be a part of that. And we're also very interested in potentially exploring agriculture sprays. So kind of put a product on a grape that either blocks the phenol, full stop, or makes it more washable, right? Because right now we know that you just can't wash it. It's not going to remove it. But is there something already approved? There's lots of products approved for use in vineyards. Can we find one that sort of protects a grape? And the flip side of that coin is if we don't find any that protect the grape, at least we have some idea about products that make it worse. So this is work that we're very interested in accelerating throughout the summer.
Well, and then prevention sort of upstream or 3 steps back. I've heard that wineries are cutting back dry shrubbery, making sure barbecues and other flammable materials are just secured and not giving that instance of sparking. And of course, we can do that too as wine lovers. I mean, let's not make our human error deliberate, like campfires and so on. Make sure they're out. What else can either wineries do that's preventative or we as wine drinkers?
Well, I mean, obviously, a lot of the big problem fires are not actually close to the vineyard. They're caused by carelessness or sometimes maliciousness, and a fire distant blows smoke in. But of course, I live in Kelowna, BC. It's hot and dry here, kind of like California. And you still drive around and you see people throwing their cigarettes out the window. And I was like, really, really, people? Like, this is so just that kind of behavior change needs to happen. That's bigger than just the wine industry. Interestingly, the idea about removing brush, like when we have these interface fires like we had last year.
What does an interface fire mean?
It just means there's forest is so close to the city that it burns into towns. And what the big risk again is the ash. So ash will get flung, and then somebody has a really nice cedar hedge right beside their house, and the patio is shaded. But that's just like gasoline, right? A spark hits that, the cedar tree burns, and then the siding of your house is on fire. So there are things there that wineries are obviously doing as well. But more on the side of things where I'm working as a analytical chemist, right? This is actually how I was brought into this project. I should mention there's a company in Kelowna. They're a for-profit analytical company called Supra Research and Development that was interested in making smoke taint tests that they could use for insurance purposes. So they said, hey, we want to help fund a PhD student. Can you make a test? And so we got started on this on the analytical side of things. And I think at the time, we probably made the best test in the world. I think we can improve on it. But at the time, I think we made the best there was. And I've already sort of explained all this about sugars, right? There's some sugar that goes on, sugar goes off. I'm a sugar guy. That's my training. So this was an interesting merger of academic interest as well as sort of an economic one. But as a result of that, what we came to the realization was that nobody bothered testing their crop if it wasn't smoky. Why would you? Why would you pay $100 for a test if there was no smoke?
Oh, that's right. Till you have the problem. Yeah.
But these things are naturally present in some grapes. I already mentioned high levels in Shiraz, but other grapes have some of them too. So here we are, we made a test. We worked and worked and worked on it, and yet nobody knows what normal is. Who knows, right? And so you're always comparing something to who knows what, right? And so you say, oh, that's high. Well, compared to what? And so one thing I think vineyards can do is we can actually start to do more routine testing so we can sort of establish that benchmark. That I think is very important. And then internally, once we have a bit of a pile of data, now you can start tasting things and you can try to internally at least correlate what the objective chemical test is telling you about your subjective perception. So one other thing we're really interested in is obviously if it's a $100 or $200 analytical test, that's going to handcuff how much willingness there is to do widespread testing across your vineyards. So another thing we're very interested in doing is making these tests simpler. You can actually use your smartphone and a little probe and you can go to different spots in your vineyard and actually get some of the same benchmark information. This, I think, would be really, really useful to helping grape producers assess risk.
Sure. Oh, that sounds great. Wow. And I'm tied always to a happy ending. I know there's been a lot of sad news between wildfires and frost, but just wondering if there's anything good that can come from wildfires. I mean, the thing that comes to me is that perhaps vintners, winemakers get to rethink what they plant and how they plant. Like if they had legacy vines that, maybe now have to be uprooted, they really can think more widely, creatively, perhaps, I don't know, in terms of how they want to start from scratch. Is there anything else that might be positive about this?
Yeah, two things. The first thing is really smoke specific, and that is we have shown that really it's the freshness of the smoke that's problematic. So in 2020, for instance, when California had its trial by fire, literally, we got all that smoke for a whole month, maybe more, right near the end, right at the beginning of harvest in BC. And it helped the crop a lot. So we were all smoke all over the place. But what it did was it dropped the temperature. And so it delayed ripening. And actually, that was good because, if it gets too hot, your sugar concentration, your brix, is actually high before the rest of the grape is mature. And so your grape quality isn't that good. And we put a cap on it in late August and had fantastic grapes because the smoke cooled the climate.
And without tainting the grapes.
Without tainting the grapes whatsoever. And again, that's why I say we should say smoke impact. We could see that the phenols were there, but there was no taint, and the grape quality was fantastic. It was hidden beautifully. So this is one thing. So fire not necessarily always bad. Really, really close fire is probably going to be problematic. The other thing I would just want to leave your viewers is just this wild idea of mine. At some point, I'd love to pursue this. We've shown that airborne aromas can transfer sometimes over great distances to grape and influence the perception, the quality of the resulting wine. And in the case of smoke, negatively. But it doesn't have to be negatively. Can we think about the positive side of this? Are there things in the air that we can smell that are unique to a certain region or actually just pleasant that can transfer to a grape and then have an impact in the quality and the perception of the resulting wine? I think there is a positive side to all of this fundamental work that we're doing, and you could call that terroir of the air.
Yeah, or airwar.
Yeah, airwar. That's great. So, for instance, there has been some evidence that eucalyptol, the main aroma compound from eucalyptus tree, can be transferred to grapes in Australia. Now, that's debatable because, again, it might be the case that grape can actually naturally make that. We need to dig into that a little bit. But think about other aromas, like in California, especially in BC where I am. All the grapes are produced in this really, really long, narrow valley surrounded by lovely conifer forests that all on a hot August day are putting out these aerosols that are all pine-derived aerosol, alpha pinene, beta pinene. It smells like an air freshener, right?
Yeah, but naturally so. And it could be a greater signature.
What does that do to a grape, right? I don't know. It might be there's a positive airwire here, and that would be really fun to tackle sometime.
It would be, and it would make the place more placey, more there-ness, because it's coming from the natural environment, just like wild yeast can settle on. And then a lot of believers in wild yeast say it expresses more of the place because the yeast is from there. These airwire molecules might make a wine more itself.
Yeah. And on that note, too, I mean, vineyards are always playing around with cover crops and things like that. Like, there's a lot of actual manipulation you could think of if we could pursue this. So, anyways, right now, the economic concern is the taint, but I don't think this story needs to stop at taint. I think there's a positive side to that coin.
Oh, that's great. I love a happy ending. Thank you for doing that. It's like I thought, oh, this is just going to be such a downer, but it's fascinating, A. And B, yeah, good things can come from it. Oh my gosh, Wes, I love this conversation. Haven't gotten to all the questions I had for you, but is there anything we haven't covered that you want to mention?
I think that's about it. I can't remember what I wanted to cover. Yeah. I mean, again, I think it's important, again, to leave your viewers with the idea that, yes, we can measure something. Yes, smoke does have an impact on grapes and wine. That doesn't necessarily always mean a taint. At the end of the day, yeah, you have to taste it, and then you have a taint. And I think people should know that vineyards and wineries across the continent are not interested in permanently ruining their brand. So they're not going to try to pull a fast one on consumers and say, well, maybe they won't notice. And so I don't think people should worry that much that people are going to deliberately put tainted products on the shelf. They're not interested in suicidal market move like that. So just because it's smoky in BC doesn't mean a BC wine is going to be tainted, because there are ways, and I've tasted them. In fact, I've done the chemistry on the wines that I tasted made with fancy yeast. And I can tell you that the phenols are there and they're not at all apparent by taste.
Yeah, I love that whole give the wine a second chance. So even if it is tainted, don't assume this winery doesn't make good wines. The taint may not have expressed itself, when the wine left the winery. So I think that's really important. Everyone deserves a second chance, so does a wine. But also, if you're hearing about wildfires, check as to where those are, because often the wine country, if they are far distant, you can still visit and they need your support more than ever from tourism, especially after all the impacts this year. So don't rule out visiting wine country just because it had wildfires in the past or you're hearing about them now. They may not even be affected in that area. This is great. Wes, where can we find you and your research online?
The easiest place to go to my employer's webpage. I work at University of British Columbia, and then you'll find me there and my email and other contact information, and that would be the best way.
That would be great. So fascinating conversation. I know we could keep going for another couple hours, but I guess you have some research to do,
I should
so
get to
I'll
work,
let you
yeah.
go. Yeah,
Yeah.
you should get it.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much for your time today, Wes. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Okay, bye for now. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Dr. Wes Zandberg. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, should you avoid buying wines from regions that have experienced wildfires? As Wes observes, just because a wine region is experienced or has experienced wildfires or even smoke drift from fires farther away, it doesn't mean that the wine will necessarily be tainted. Winery owners are not trying to pull a fast one over consumers by trying to sell them tainted wine as it would ruin their brand. And in fact, it's the opposite in that many wineries have pulled their wines from the market upon discovering they were tainted. Number 2, what are the main causes of wildfires in wine country? So BC's Okanagan Valley experienced severe wildfires due to arson. There was also some suspicion that some of the fires were ignited by train wheel sparks and logging operations, so the latter was closed down in the summer, especially because it was so dry. The vast majority, though, of wildfires are started by lightning or human causes, both errors and malevolence. Number 3, which 2 weather-based factors are the strongest predictors of the severity of wildfires each season? Wes explains that the quicker the snow melts and evaporates, leaving drier conditions, the greater the risk of wildfires. This is exacerbated if seasonal rains are below average, especially in June and July. Number 4, what impact do wildfires have on the taste of your wine, and why is it so difficult to predict whether smoke-exposed grapes will in fact produce tainted wine? There isn't a chemical test right now to determine whether smoke-exposed grapes will actually produce smoke-tainted wines, and even if there were one, it could be so mild as to be undetectable. Smoke taint also doesn't express itself in unfermented grapes, making it even harder to predict its impact on the wine eventually. Wes and his fellow researchers are working on tools to make detection possible and therefore mitigating its impact. Number 5, why does smoke taint intensify as wine ages? The wine taint gets worse as wine ages because the wine develops new, subtle, tertiary aroma compounds, while some of the secondary aromas, and these might be bolder, diminish, and these may have been masking the taint aromas, revealing what was already there. And number 6, how can wineries mitigate the risk of producing smoke-tainted wine? Australia has pioneered techniques such as making rosé that's not fermented on skins where the taint is. Wes notes that smoke taint is less problematic for white wine because it too isn't fermented on skins. He also suggests that winemakers take it easy on the macerating enzymes to minimize the impact from grape skins on the juice. Fancy yeast may work, he adds, but it's risky, as it's difficult to predict how and why it works, and what may happen the next time. Some winemakers have tried different fining agents or additives to absorb smoke taint aromas with varying degrees of success. Picking by hand rather than machine harvesting also helps, since the grapes are more likely to arrive at the winery whole rather than crushed. It's also gentler for even grapes not at risk of smoke taint, so it often produces better wine. However, it's more costly to harvest this way, and so, like most things in life, there are trade-offs. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode. Were you surprised at how wildfires can affect the wines you drink? Have you ever had the misfortune of opening a tainted wine? Are you feeling more motivated, like I am, to be more mindful of the things we can do to help prevent wildfires when we visit wine regions? Email me at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a wine that has risen from the ashes and gives you pure, untainted pleasure. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.